Now we come to the third intermolecular force. This is hydrogen bonding. What exactly is hydrogen bonding? We may have heard of it before, but may not remember exactly what it is. Well, hydrogen bonding is defined as an attraction between a hydrogen that's attached to a highly electronegative atom. For our purposes, those will be nitrogen, oxygen, and fluorine. And so it's an attraction between a hydrogen that's bonded to one of those atoms and a lone pair of a nearby highly electronegative atom, so nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine. Now, why nitrogen, oxygen, and fluorine? Well, if we look at the bonds, the NH bond, the OH bond, and the FH bond, because nitrogen, oxygen, and fluorine are so electronegative, there is a large bond dipole that points towards the electronegative atom. This leaves a partial positive charge on the hydrogen, and because hydrogen is the simplest element and has only electrons in the 1s orbital, that leaves a partial positive charge in just a spherical s orbital on the hydrogen. Thus, hydrogen just acts as a small spherical center of positive charge that is a perfect target for any partial negative charges that are present in solution. And so it turns out that hydrogen bonding, the reason we talk about it after dipole-dipole forces, even though it is of greater energy, is because hydrogen bonding is actually a specific subset of dipole-dipole forces. It's a dipole-dipole force between a partial negative on nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine and the partial positive on a hydrogen that's bonded to nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine. Now, here's an example of hydrogen bonding shown here. So the HO bond shown here, this is a covalent bond within the molecule, but then there's this strong interaction between a lone pair on the water, on the oxygen of water, and the hydrogen of an adjacent water molecule. And this strong interaction is known as the hydrogen bond. It's due to the large partial positive on hydrogen and then interacting with the partial negative on oxygen. We can see that also occurring between nitrogen and the NH bond here in ammonia, or we can have it between various cases. So a nitrogen lone pair interacting with a hydrogen that's bonded to oxygen, or vice versa. Or you can have any of these electronegative atoms, a lone pair on them interacting with a hydrogen that's bonded to fluorine. Now, hydrogen bonding itself, we mentioned it was a dipole-dipole force, and it is the strongest of the dipole-dipole forces and can be up to about 10% of the strength of a normal covalent bond. And we talk about hydrogen bonding and highlight it specifically because it is responsible for a host of biological phenomena that underpin life at its very fundamental level. So we'll do a couple of examples of that. The first is the DNA double helix. You're probably familiar with this structure, this kind of famous structure where two strands of DNA are held together in this helix structure where we have a major and minor groove. And what's important to highlight here is that the two strands of DNA are held together specifically by hydrogen bonds between base pairs on adjacent DNA strands. So if we see nitrogen being shown here in blue, oxygen in red, and hydrogen in white, we can see a hydrogen bonding interaction between the nitrogen, a lone pair on the nitrogen of one base pair, and the hydrogen that's bonded to nitrogen of another base pair. Similarly, we have another hydrogen bonding interaction between the oxygen of one base pair and the hydrogen that's bonded to nitrogen of another base pair. And so it's really hydrogen bonds that hold the DNA into this particular structure, which is then used in life and in all cells. Another example of hydrogen bonding at work is the density of ice. Now, this is very important. If we take an ice cube and drop it in water, you'll notice that it floats. This is extraordinarily useful because it means that when lakes freeze over, they freeze top down rather than from the bottom up. And that allows life in the water to continue to survive even when the lake is frozen over. But why exactly does ice float? Well, in order for ice to float, it must mean that the density of ice, so that would be water at 0 degrees, is less than the density of water at room temperature. This is a little bit unusual for many liquids. As you cool them down and bring the molecules closer together, the density increases. And so the solid form is normally more dense than the liquid form. But here, the converse is true. And so what this essentially means is that the water molecules are closer together in the liquid form than they are in the solid form. Now, why would this be the case? Why would the molecules be closer together in the liquid than they are in the solid form? Well, it has to do with hydrogen bonding. When the molecules are in their liquid form, they're all moving around with that freedom of motion. And so although there is hydrogen bonding present, many of those hydrogen bonds are broken or they're not all aligned perfectly. And so the water molecules, even if they don't have, even if they're not participating in hydrogen bonding, get just right up next to each other and move about. However, when you cool the system down, each of the water molecules will now align themselves specifically to maximize the number of hydrogen bonding interactions. When this occurs, it ends up forcing the water molecules to be farther apart from each other as they align themselves to maximize the number of hydrogen bonds. And this now forces the water molecules farther apart from each other. It also places them in a very nicely ordered structure, which we see in something like this snowflake here. But as a result of the larger distance between molecules, we now have a lower density of water in the solid form than we do in the liquid form. And this is why ice floats and lakes freeze top down. So it's a very important concept for hydrogen bonding. Now, the last intermolecular force that we discuss here is something known as dispersion forces. Sometimes they're referred to as London dispersion forces after one of the scientists who spent quite a bit of time and study on them. But dispersion forces are defined as being attractive forces between the induced dipoles of nonpolar atoms or molecules. So we started out, remember, with ion dipole forces, full charge with a partial positive or negative charge. Then we moved to dipole-dipole forces, which is partial charges interacting with partial charges. Now we're dealing with attractive forces between induced dipoles. What exactly is an induced dipole? Well, let's take helium atoms as an example. So very simple, helium atom just has 2 electrons rotating around it in its 1s orbital. And most of the time there's no, a helium atom is not, has no partial charges to it in its normal state. But every once in a while, when those electrons are moving around the nucleus, at some point, those electrons are going to both end up on the same side of the nucleus, as is shown here in atom B. So for one solitary instant in time, because both electrons are on one side of the nucleus, we now have we now have a temporary dipole, where one side is, for a brief instant of time, partially negatively charged, and the other side is now missing electrons, so it's partially positively charged. So for one instant in time, I have a dipole. Now, if that atom is in close contact with another atom, the brief moment in time where the atom B has that dipole, that temporary dipole, that distribution of charges will then induce a dipole. These 2 electrons will repel the electrons in atom A to put them on the other side, and we will now have an induced dipole for atom A that wasn't there in the beginning. And now we have an electrostatic attraction between the negative and positive ends of the 2 molecules that have this induced dipole. Now, a brief instant later, that dipole disappears as the electrons move back to kind of normal regions. But for very brief instants in time, we have this induced dipole, and thus we have a small amount of attraction between even non-polar atoms and molecules. Now, not surprisingly, this type of induced dipole is not a very strong force. So dispersion forces are very weak, generally 1% to 0.001% or 0.01% of the strength of a covalent bond. There's a few features with them that we should go through. So one thing to note with these induced dipoles is we look just at the noble gases. So those are just single atoms. We'll notice that as we go from helium to argon to krypton to xenon, the boiling point increases as we go along. We'll notice the same thing with nonpolar diatomics. So fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine, we see the same increase in the boiling point. But remember, boiling point is a measure of the intermolecular forces, but these are nonpolar molecules. There's no ion dipole, there's no dipole-dipole forces. What's going on here? Well, it's important to note that dispersion forces increase with increasing molecular weight. So as I increase the molecular weight of the species, then my dispersion forces also increase. We can sort of see that shown here. And with the single atoms or the diatomic molecules, where you'll notice that you'll notice a couple things. So as we move left to right, we do see, as in the chart on the left, we do see an increase in the boiling point. We'll also notice that the atoms or the molecules get larger as I increase the molecular weight. I have more electrons, more electron shells, more electrons around the atoms. And this then leads us to this concept of polarizability. What is polarizability? Polarizability is the ease of forming induced dipoles. So you can imagine for something like helium, where I have only 2 electrons, that forming that induced dipole is actually fairly difficult and very brief in time. There's only 2 electrons, so the maximum charge I guess I could have would be a partial -2, I guess, on one side of the molecule versus the other. If I have 10 electrons around the molecule, however, then if I had all of those 10 on one side of the molecule, I would have a larger dipole, and I would be able to induce a larger dipole in another molecule than if I only had 2. And that's the concept of polarizability. The more electrons that you have, generally illustrated by increasing molecular weight, because as we increase the atomic weight of the individual atoms, that increases by increasing the number of protons and electrons. So I have more electrons present. So as I increase the number of electrons that I have, I can increase the magnitude of the dipole that I can induce and the ease of forming that dipole. If I have a large amount, if I have a big cloud of electrons, then it's much easier to deform that than if I have just a very small one. And as a result, then dispersion forces increase with molecular weight because the polarizability increases with molecular weight, and thus the magnitude of the induced dipole, leading finally to the magnitude of the attractive forces between those induced dipoles. So to summarize here, we've got 4 different intermolecular attractions or forces. We've got dispersion forces, and it turns out that all species, all atoms and molecules, whether they're polar or nonpolar, have dispersion forces. Because even if I have a polar molecule, I can still induce a further dipole to it just by the polarizability of the electrons around the polar molecule. So there is still going to be a dispersion force contribution to everything. But dispersion forces are the only forces that are present for isolated atoms or for nonpolar molecules. Now, if I have a polar molecule that does not have OH, NH, or HF bonds, then I will have both dispersion forces, because everything has dispersion forces, but I'll also have dipole-dipole forces from the normal dipoles of the molecule. If I have a polar molecule that contains those OH, NH, or HF bonds, then I will have, in addition to the normal dipole-dipole, I will also have hydrogen bonding, very specifically. So that will be another additional type of intermolecular force. And then finally, if I've got ionic solids that are dissolved in polar liquids, those will also have dispersion forces, but then they will have ion dipole interactions as well. So let's go through a couple of examples here. How do we apply this? So we've got two problems. First, we have this sort of strange trend here down the different groups. So what's going on in these four different colored traces? So in red, what we are looking at is hydrogen attached to an atom in that group 6A or group 16. So that would be oxygen, sulfur, selenium, and tellurium. And we're looking at the different compounds with hydrogen of that. So H2O, this data point would be for H2S, this one would be for H2SE, and this one is for H2TE. And what we're looking at is the trend in the boiling point. And we've got the molecular weight listed here because the molecular weight increases as you go down the periodic table. And then the same thing here in green, we're looking at the hydrogen bonded to the halogens, so fluorine, chlorine, bromine, and iodine. In blue, we're looking at the nitrogen column, so nitrogen, phosphorus, and so forth. And then in orange, we've got the carbon columns, so carbon, silicon, germanium, and tin. And we'll notice let's just take the orange line here. What we notice is that there's a fairly steady increase in the boiling point with increasing molecular weight. And if we look at CH4, SiH4, GeH4, SnH4, and classify it as what do we have present? Well, there's no polar bonds here, where it's not polar. So it's a non-polar molecule. So the only forces that are present are dispersion forces. And we know that dispersion forces increase with increasing molecular weight. So this trend makes complete sense. However, the blue, green, and red lines, normally, if we look from the second data point to the right, those also trend with increasing boiling point, with increasing molecular weight that follows the increasing dispersion forces. But then we have these outliers, H2O, HF, and NH3. Why are their boiling points so much higher, even though they're the lowest in molecular weight? The real reason here has to do with what forces are present. So in these three cases, H2O, HF, and NH3, if we go through the line, it's polar molecules that have OH, NH, or HF bonds, so we have hydrogen bonding. And that is a strong force that then increases the boiling point of those species. Sulfur or chlorine or phosphorus are not on our list of hydrogen bonding groups. And so H2S or HCl or pH3, these are not going to have the hydrogen bonding component. And so their boiling point will be lower since they don't have that force. And then as we go left to right, we can increase with increasing molecular weight, similar to just the increase due to dispersion. Now the second problem is asking us, rank the following molecules in order of increasing boiling point. And what is or are the dominant intermolecular forces at play? So we've got four different molecules shown here. And what we need to do first is we need to just go through and evaluate what type of intermolecular forces are present. So we start here on the left. What I will notice is that I have a molecule with carbon and hydrogen bonds. I do have a polar carbon-oxygen bond and hydrogen-oxygen bond. So I do have a polar molecule here with some dipole moment that's going to point towards the oxygen. And I also have an OH bond. So hydrogen bonding, if I have a solution of this mixture, I'm going to have some hydrogen bonding involved. So I've got hydrogen bonding and dipole, and then of course dispersion. All of them will have dispersion forces. The one in the middle is of similar molecular weight to the one on the left. So the dispersion forces between those two should be fairly similar. But this one now has two OH bonds, or two oxygen hydrogen bonds, one on the left, one on the right. It will still be polar. It may look symmetrical, right at the moment, but if we were to draw a three-dimensional structure, we would see that not all of the orientations of this would cancel out the dipole moments. So this is a polar molecule, has polar bonds, and it has hydrogen bonding capability. But what's important is it has more hydrogen bonding capability than the first one. So this has hydrogen bonding, dipole-dipole, and dispersion, just like the first molecule, but it has more hydrogen bonding. So we would expect there to be more intermolecular forces at play for the second one than the first one. Then I have another case where I have a polar molecule with carbon-oxygen, hydrogen-oxygen bonds, so dipole-dipole forces. And again, on oxygen-hydrogen or hydrogen-oxygen bond, so I have here, I'm going to have hydrogen bonding present for this one. And the only difference between this one and the very first one is molecular weight. So this one will have the same amount of hydrogen bonding, but there's less, but there will be less dispersion forces because it's lower in molecular weight. So the hydrogen bonding contribution should be similar, the dipole-dipole contribution should be similar, but the dispersion contribution would be less. And then finally, we have this molecule here all the way on the right, which is non-polar. No polar bonds, no real dipole moment. Non-polar molecules only have dispersion forces. We have dispersion forces for this last case. So if we're ranking in terms of increasing boiling point, what we're looking at is we want to, we're going to rank increasing boiling point by increasing intermolecular forces, because the more intermolecular forces, the greater the boiling point. So I'll start with the one that has the least amount of intermolecular forces. That's the molecule all the way here on the right. This has only dispersion, so I will label this as 1. That has the lowest boiling point. Then I have 3 cases where I have dispersion, dipole-dipole, and hydrogen bonding. But this third molecule in has similar amounts of hydrogen bonding to the first molecule, similar amounts of dipole-dipole, but will have less dispersion because it's at a lower molecular weight. And so this one would be the second, lowest. Then between just the first molecule and the second molecule, the difference here is the amount of hydrogen bonding. They have similar molecular weights, so the dispersions are similar. They've got dipole, they're both polar, they're going to have relatively similar dipole-dipole interactions, but hydrogen bonding, the second molecule has much more hydrogen bonding, which means that it will have the most amount of intermolecular forces and have the highest boiling point, which means that this first one is then the third, and this last one is the fourth. In terms of ranking them, 1 being the lowest boiling point and 4 being the highest boiling point. So that's how we kind of take these intermolecular forces and apply them to some of the world that we see around us.